Appreciate my distinguished colleague from Illinois who is on the floor, who has worked with us in this regard, come to a common view and effort to maximize the effect on Iran, minimize the effect to both us and the global economy, and certainly urge passage of this amendment and yield the floor to him.
Mr. President.
Senator from Illinois is recognized.
Mr. President, I rise in strong support of the Menendez-Kirk amendment, and I particularly want to thank my partner in this, Senator Menendez, a member of the Banking Committee with me, who has been a leader on concern regarding Iranian terror and Iranian proliferation of weapons of mass destruction and repression of human rights for 20 or 25 years now. And we are reaching now a decisive point in the relations of Iran to other countries, and most importantly to the United States in this. I think this amendment comes at one of the final hours of how peaceful means and economic sanctions can be used to avoid a conflict. And that's why it's so important for the Senate to adopt the Menendez-Kirk amendment with the long-term goal of collapsing the central bank of Iran so that this country does not produce nuclear weapons that would destabilize the entire Middle East. Now, we launched this effort, Senator Menendez and I, Senator Schumer, particularly in August, when we called on our president to sanction the central bank of Iran. In these partisan times in which the two sides are far apart on so many different issues, we had 92 senators, all but 8 senators, signed the letter saying collapse the central bank of Iran. Use this as a tool in our diplomatic war chest to make sure that we can remove one of the greatest dangers from the country, from one of the most dangerous regimes. The record is pretty clear. The International Atomic Energy Agency has ruled on the subject of Iran. We remember the IAEA because the IAEA, with regard to Iraq and the Saddam Hussein weapons of mass destruction program, was consistently correct, and the Bush administration was wrong. The IAEA said in its intelligence estimate that the threat was overstated in Iraq. And so with that level of credibility, we should listen to the IAEA on the subject of Iran. And there they have been extremely clear as well. They have outlined how Iran has a separate enrichment cycle going way above the enrichment of uranium necessary to fuel a civilian reactor, 5%, now towards 20% where there's no civilian use, moving towards the 98% needed to power a nuclear weapon. They've talked about undisclosed nuclear facilities, especially a brand new one, which appears to be the final cascade necessary to enrich uranium to bomb-grade material. They most ominously talk about a warhead of particular weight that would equate what would be in a nuclear weapon. And unlike a conventional warhead, which basically has a spark initiator and explosive material, this warhead has an electric generator aboard that is only used to power and initiate a nuclear explosion. And so it's clear from the statements of the independent United Nations agency that Iran, a signature on the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, is violating its obligations and is creating, as fast as it can, a nuclear weapons program. We know also that Iran has become the first spacefaring nation of the 21st century, that unlike the North Koreans who have failed in their space launch time after time, it was actually Iran that was able to orbit the OMID satellite aboard the Saphir rocket as the first nation to be able to accomplish that technological feat in this century. And as we know, if you can orbit anywhere over the Earth, you can deorbit anywhere over the Earth. An ominous sign for the future security of Saudi Arabia, of Iraq, of our allies in Turkey, but especially our friends in Israel and long-term the United States. The record of Iran and this regime with regard to the rights of its own citizens shows the character of its government. Long ago, we knew about 330,000 Baha'i citizens of Iran who have been forced to register their addresses, whose kids have all been kicked out of university, whose families are not allowed any contracting with the government of Iran. The bureaucratic mechanisms of Kristallnacht have formed. We have seen this movie in a different decade, wearing different uniforms in a different country. But the ominous signs are it may turn out in the same way. Many people in the international community know about Neda, who was protesting the stealing of an election in Iran, and her death simply for protesting on that stolen election. We know about Hussein Renagi, the first blogger who called for tolerance in Iran, who is now languishing in Evin prison. We know about Nasrin Sotoudeh, age 48, mother of two, whose sole crime was representing Shireen Ebadi, a Nobel laureate, and how she was thrown in jail. Beyond the nuclear program, beyond the missile program, beyond the repression of human rights in the country, we know about Iran's long record of terror, that Iran is the paymaster for Hezbollah. We've known that for a long time, that they have tortured the poor country of Lebanon. But in some sense, there was a symmetry. We understood how this Shiite power would support a Shiite sect in Lebanon, even though they spoke Arabic. But then, over the last decade, they jumped the Shiite-Sunni divide, and they also backed a new terror group called Hamas that was trying to surround our allies in Israel with missiles and terror necessary to extinguish the Jewish people and the Jewish state. We know how the Iranian regime is also now one of the central pillars of the Syrian dictatorship, and how as that dictatorship hangs on to power, it's somewhat on the back of Iranian money and Iranian weapons and expertise that allows them to repress their own people. And then most recently, we have seen that on the back of a bipartisan certification that Iran supports terror from President Reagan, President Bush, President Clinton, President Bush, and President Obama, we've seen a higher level of irresponsibility on behalf of the Iranian regime. According to our own Attorney General, the head of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard's Quds Force, Suleiman, tried to contact and hire a Mexican drug cartel, one of the most dangerous, the Zetas, to assassinate the Saudi Arabian ambassador to the United States at a Georgetown restaurant. And that was only because the incompetent Iranians hired a DEA agent in Mexico that we found out about this. That they would, had they been able to accomplish their goals, lit off a car bomb in Washington, D.C., paid for by the government of Iran, and briefed all the way to the top level of their government. And today we find that after they had their Basji radical young persons movement overrun the British embassy, seizing classified documents and holding for a time 50 British personnel, shades of the 1979 hostage crisis, when for 440 days Iranian radicals held Americans, that our allies in the United Kingdom have now made the decision to remove all Iranian diplomats from the United Kingdom. We've seen other calls, brave calls of allied action. A man I admire greatly, the President of France, President Sarkozy, has called for ceasing all purchases of Iranian oil. He has publicly called for the collapse of the Iranian central bank. And so it's with this level of irresponsibility on nuclear technology, on missiles, on the repression of human rights, on the support of terror, on a plot to kill Americans inside Washington, D.C., and the overrunning of an embassy of our closest ally in Europe, the United Kingdom, that we come forward with the bipartisan Menendez-Kirk Amendment. What does this amendment do? It basically says, in part, if you do business with the Central Bank of Iran, you cannot do business with the United States of America. It forces financial institutions and other businesses around the world to choose between the small and shrinking $300 billion economy of Iran and the $14 trillion economy of the United States. In that contest, we all know how just about everyone will choose, and we wish that choice to be made. We seek to break the stable financial intermediary in between Iranian oil contracts and the outside world, so that it will just be easier to buy oil from elsewhere, and working with our allies to make that oil more plentiful. Now, we realize the concerns with this amendment. Some have said that this amendment comes too quickly, too soon. And so that's where Senator Menendez and I have agreed, and working with the administration, to give time and flexibility. Under this amendment, nothing happens right away. Several weeks and several months go by before any action is required, and that is intended as a signal to oil markets that this requirement is coming, that we seek for you as our allies, for example, in Japan or South Korea or in Turkey, to wind up your current contracts and supplies, to meet your needs by other means. And by the way, other means are coming. We are expecting Libyan production to double. We're also expecting Iraqi production to go way up. And of course, we know the swing production of Saudi Arabia, no love lost towards the Iranians after having tried to kill their ambassador here, and working with the oil suppliers to make sure that everyone's needs are met while funding to the Iranian regime is slowly choked off. We also provide two waivers in this amendment, and this is very important at the request of the administration. We say that if there is a temporary restriction of oil supply, that this amendment can be suspended for a time. And if there's some unforeseen national security disaster, some real problem that the President can see, also he has that flexibility. But the general picture is this. The Central Bank of Iran is the heart and financial soul of a web of terror, of nuclear production, of human rights abuse, and the oppression of other peoples, principally in Syria, that is no longer acceptable to the international community. And so that this regime should operate without the benefit of funding from the international community. I think this amendment is one of the last best hopes for peace, to bring effective economic sanctions to bear so that a burden doesn't fall on our friends in Saudi Arabia or our allies in Israel to do the far more tough military work that may be required to remove this common danger. Many people say that you can't convince a country who is on a nuclear weapons course to reverse course, and I say, well, you show your ignorance of history. Because we saw the Argentines give up a nuclear program, the Brazilians, likely the South Africans detonated a weapon and then decided to give up their program. In Kazakhstan, in Ukraine, nuclear weapons were given up. In Libya, nuclear weapons were given up. And with effective pressure, my hope is that it can happen here. We know that President Ahmadinejad is not popular. We know that the regime in general does not enjoy the support, especially of its younger citizens. We know that at least half of Iranians in a stolen election voted for the other guy, who was not allowed to take power. And so this amendment comes forward with solid bipartisan pedigree. It has been endorsed specifically by Senators Lieberman, Schumer, Kyle, Feinstein, Gillibrand, Manchin, Nelson, Stabenow, and Heller under Senator Menendez and I's leadership. For us, it gives time for the oil markets to adjust and unhook from Iran. It gives flexibility to the administration, but most importantly, it helps us deal in an economic and diplomatic way with one of the greatest dangers to our society. We think about the future ahead, and some people say this amendment could cause some disruption in oil markets. And yes, we're asking countries to unhook from the terror regime in Iran. But just think about the instability that would come if military conflict broke out between Iran and Israel, or worse, if nuclear weapons were loose from Iran in the Middle East. If we do nothing, as soon as 2 years from now, we could have a detonation of an Iranian nuclear weapon in the Middle East. If we show weakness and a lack of resolve, then countries in that region will decide they need nuclear weapons programs of their own. We will give birth to the Saudi nuclear weapon program, the Egyptian nuclear weapon program, and others. This amendment is an attempt to make sure that the 21st century is not the most dangerous century ever facing young Americans, and to use the full economic weight of the United States, working with our allies, to remove what is the greatest emerging danger. I think Senator Menendez is living in the spirit of those who watched the 1930s and worried about when America slept. Well, we're not asleep. We know exactly what is happening. And by decisive bipartisan action of the Senate, we're bringing the best pressure to bear of non-military means to make sure that our kids inherit a much safer 21st century. And with that, I commend my partner in this effort and urge the Senate to adopt the Menendez-Kirk Amendment and yield back.
Senator from New York is recognized.
Well, thank you, Mr. President. And first, I rise in full support of this amendment and want to thank Senator Menendez for his leadership on this issue, which is dated from a long time back, and Senator Kirk, who has really lit a flame of concern under this body about this issue, and justifiably so. They've done a great job, and I want to thank both of them for their strong efforts. Now, I believe that when it comes to Iran, of course, we should never take the military option off the table. But I have long argued that economic sanctions should be tried first and could be actually very, very effective in choking Iran's nuclear ambitions before any military option need be considered. But they have to be done strongly, and they have to be done well, and they have to be done toughly. Earlier this month, the report on Iran's nuclear program by the IAEA was alarming and proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that despite the lies, there's no other word to put it, by the Iranian government, they're developing a nuclear weapon. And according to recent reports, Iran could have at least one workable nuclear weapon within a year and another maybe 6 months after that. The new information shows that Iran's been working relentlessly to acquire the capability to produce a nuclear weapon, and additionally, the IAEA report details a highly organized program dedicated to acquiring the skills necessary to produce and test a bomb. So I say to America and the world, enough is enough. The extreme and dangerous government of Iranian leader Mahmoud Ahmadinejad must be held accountable. One of our greatest problems that we will live with for decades is a nuclear Iran. And we do not want to look back and say, if we were only a little quicker, a little stronger, a little tougher, we might have prevented it. The Iranians, when they see that they might face real economic punishment if they proceed in developing nuclear weapons, have turned back in the past. And they can do it again. And the economic sanctions that we have begun to impose, and I salute the President, he's worked very hard on this issue. I've talked with him on this issue. I know he believes in it strongly. I know that the President knows the danger of a nuclear Iran and is working very hard in that regard. But now we must, every time we find ways to impose economic sanctions that have real teeth against Iran, they try to find a way around it. And our job is to move quickly and plug those loopholes. The Iran Central Bank, we have sanctioned Iranian banks and pretty much prevented them from doing the things we don't want them to do. According to all reports, it's had a real effect on the Iranian National Guard and on the economy of Iran itself. But the Iranian government has now tried to move through the Central Bank of Iran. It's been heavily involved in terrorism and the financing of nuclear and conventional weapons technology. It's played a critical role, the Central Bank has, in helping other Iranian banks circumvent our effective financial sanctions. So to close 10 holes but leave one open will not achieve our goal, in the last remaining open hole through which financial commerce can flow into Iran for prohibited activities is the central bank. The threat of sanctions against the central bank will frighten Iran, might make them think twice before they proceed in developing this nuclear weapon, because they will pay real economic consequences that will hurt the Iranian regime and its henchmen above all, and will unfortunately hurt the Iranian people as well. But there is no choice in the matter. And so, we must strengthen the President's hand as he continues to work to build an international coalition determined to prevent the rise of a nuclear Iran. By giving the administration the capability to impose crippling sanctions on Iran should they continue with their nuclear weapons program, Congress is putting forth a tough and smart plan to address the real threat Iran poses to the U.S. and our allies, and of course Israel. This amendment will do three important things to strangle Iran's ability to continue with its nuclear weapons program. First, it will freeze the assets of Iranian financial institutions that come under U.S. jurisdiction. Second, it would prevent the maintenance in America of correspondence accounts by foreign financial institutions conducting significant petroleum-related transactions with Iran's central bank. And lastly, it would urge the President to undertake a diplomatic initiative to wean other nations off Iranian crude. The amendment supports the administration's actions last week, designating the entire Iranian banking system as a threat to government and financial institutions because of Iran's illicit activities, including its pursuit of nuclear weapons and its support of terrorism. Mr. President, Senators Kirk and Menendez have done an excellent job crafting a comprehensive plan, a smart plan, a tough plan, to arm the administration with the tools they need to put a stop to Iran's nuclear rogue program. I have optimism that this will have a real effect and could indeed deter Iran if we move and move quickly. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment. I yield the balance of my time and note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
I ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I rise in support of the amendment offered by our colleagues, Senator Menendez and Senator Kirk, and I want to thank them for their leadership on this issue. To me, this is an extremely important amendment that I hope will get the support of all of the members of the Senate. It tightens the restrictions we already have against Iran. And I want to compliment the Obama administration for the work they've done internationally by expanding the sanctions against Iran, Iran's petroleum and petrochemical industries. It's been effective because we've gotten other countries to follow the United States leadership. I think everybody in this body understands the risks of Iran to the security of not only its region, but the entire world. Iran's a very dangerous nation. It has ambitions to spread terrorism in the region and to affect U.S. interests. It's for that reason that we cannot allow Iran to become a nuclear weapon state. Our most effective way to deal with this is to isolate Iran and to make sure that the sanctions that are imposed actually will accomplish the objective of penalizing the country but not the individual people of Iran. So the amendment offered by Senator Menendez and Senator Kirk would allow us to expand the sanctions against Iran to the central bank of Iran. The amendment requires the President to prohibit all transactions in property and interest in property of the Iranian financial institutions that touch U.S. financial institutions and to prohibit the maintenance of correspondence or payable through accounts by foreign banks that have conducted financial transactions with the central bank of Iran. What does that mean? It means that we are really trying to put the sanctions where they'll have the most impact, and that is on the financial system of Iran itself. The Iranian central bank depends upon other banks around the world, and this amendment would allow us to have an effective way to isolate the central bank of Iran, putting additional focus on the Iranian policies that have violated the United Nations resolutions. Iran has violated their commitments. They violated their commitments as it relates to their nuclear programs. They haven't complied with agreements that they've entered into. And it's important that the international community stand united. This is important, as I said, for stability of the region. It's important for the security of Israel, our closest ally in that region. It's important for Arab states that have talked to us about the danger of Iran. It's important for U.S. interests. So it's important that we get this moving. Iran's complete disregard for its obligations under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and its directives of the multiple UN Security Council resolutions belie the government's continued insistence that its nuclear program is one based upon its energy needs. It's not based upon its energy needs. It's trying to become a nuclear weapon state, and something that we must make sure does not occur. Mr. President, we need to take all steps we can in order to deny Iran the ability to have international legitimacy while they are violating their international commitments. This amendment continues the U.S. leadership on this issue. And it follows up on, I think, the work that our nation has done in getting international support to make it clear to Iran if they continue along these policies of violating their international commitments, they're going to continue to be isolated, and it's going to affect the economy of their nation. I would urge my colleagues to support the amendment. And with that, Mr. President, I would yield the floor.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Okaka.
Senator from Alabama is recognized.
I would ask to be notified after 10 minutes.
Currently in a quorum call.
Mr. President, I ask consent that the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
And I would ask that I be notified after 10 minutes.
Chair will do so.
Mr. President, I've offered an amendment that clarifies, although that's not exactly the right word, I think, the fact that a unlawful combatant or a combatant that's held by the United States military for being an enemy of the United States, a combatant against the United States, or an unlawful combatant, is not therefore entitled to be released if the United States military or the civilian courts choose to prosecute them for a crime and they are acquitted or receive a sentence that's not too long and they serve that sentence. These are entirely different matters. So there are two questions. Are you an enemy combatant of the United States? These are the kinds of prisoners of war in World War II. Germans, for example, that were kept in Aliceville, Alabama. They stayed in a prisoner of war camp until the war was over and they went home. They didn't violate the rules of war. They weren't prosecuted for any crimes. They were just simply not released so that they would go and rejoin the battle in an attempt to kill more American servicemen and women. But they were lawful. They wore uniforms. They complied with the rules of war, and they were not prosecutable. But when a person sneaks into the country with an intent to murder women and children and innocent non-combatants, does not wear a uniform, and violates other provisions of the rules of war, then they can be not only held as a combatant, but they can be held and tried for commission of crimes against the United States. That's the classical standard of law. I believe it's clear that if a person is captured and tried for a crime and, let's say, acquitted, whether in civil or military commission, they are not entitled to be released. And to that end, I would quote a number of statements to that effect, but I really believe the legal system would be a lot better off if we speak clearly on that matter today, so there's no doubt whatsoever. But President Obama, May 21st, 2009, said this, but when the prosecution process is complete, there may be a number of people who cannot be prosecuted for past crimes, but who nonetheless pose a threat to the security of the United States. In other words, they remain prisoners of war who are likely to join the enemy if they're released. He goes on to say these are people who, in effect, remain at war with the United States. As I said, I'm not going to release individuals who endanger the American people. I think that's consistent with all rules of war, and I think the President was right in that statement. Attorney General Eric Holder, in November of 2009, before the Judiciary Committee, said, I personally think that we should involve Congress in ensuring that the executive branch has the authority to make that decision, that we should interact with this committee in crafting a law of war detention process or program. In other words, he called on us to work with them in developing statutes, but historically I think the law is clear at any rate. Jay Johnson, the general counsel to the Department, who came from the New York Times as general counsel for the New York Times, not a career Department of Justice Defense attorney, said this before the Senate Armed Services Committee. The question of what happens if there's an acquittal is an interesting question. I think as a matter of legal authority, if you have the authority under the laws of war to detain someone, and the Hamdi decision said that in 2004, that is true irrespective of what happens on the prosecution side. As a matter of legal authority, I think we have law of war authority. And pursuant to that authority, Congress granted us with the authorization for the use of military force, as the Supreme Court interpreted, to hold a person provided they continue to be a security threat, and we have the authority in the first place. So again, he's saying if you're not acquitted, that they can be held if they continue to be a threat. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton on Meet the Press November of last year, Mr. Gregory, but my question is, are we committed with these terrorist suspects that if they are acquitted in civilian courts, they should be released? Secretary Clinton? Well, no. Senator Jack Reed, a West Point graduate, a member of the Armed Services Committee. I'm proud to serve with my Democratic colleague. This is what he said last November, or November a year before last. There are no guarantees of conviction, but under basic principles of international law, as long as these individuals pose a threat, they can be detained, and they will. I do not believe they will be released under the principle of preventive detention, which is recognized during hostilities. So, Mr. President, I believe this is legislation would do not much more, but importantly, will affirm the classical understanding of our laws of war, and as a result, the people who are charged can be tried. If they're not convicted of crime, they can still be detained. And I would note that an individual American soldier or German soldier or Japanese soldier who's lawful and released has a duty to report back to their military unit and commence hostilities until the war is over. Senator Graham is here, and a current JAG officer in the United States Air Force who studied these matters very, very closely and has been engaged in this debate so eloquently. I'm delighted to have you here and your support for this amendment, and
would the
perhaps you
Senator
have some comment.
yield for a question?
I would be pleased to.
Well, thank you. As I understand, the purposes of this amendment is basically to have the Congress on record for the concept that once you're determined to be an enemy combatant, a part of the enemy force, there's no requirement to let you go at any certain time, because in war it would be silly to let an enemy prisoner go back to the fight for no good reason. And as you've indicated, in the law of war, you can be prosecuted for a war crime. You could be taken to a federal court and be prosecuted for an act of terrorism. But if you're acquitted, that's not an event that would require us to release you if the evidence still exists you're a threat to the country and part of the enemy force. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Now, what I would like my colleagues to understand is that no German prisoner in World War II had the ability to go to a federal judge and say, let me go. If you had brought up the concept in World War II that an American citizen collaborating with the Nazis could not be held as an enemy combatant, you had been run out of town. Does the Senator agree with me that in every war we've fought since the beginning of our nation, unfortunately, there have been episodes of where American citizens side with the enemy?
That is certainly true.
And do you agree with me that our Supreme Court as recently as about 3 to 4 years ago affirmed the fact that we can hold our own as enemy combatants when the evidence suggests that they've joined forces with the enemy? That is the law.
That is the law as I understand it, Senator Graham.
Do you agree with me, Senator, that that makes perfect sense, that an American who helps the Nazis is committed an act of war, not a common crime?
That is correct.
Do you agree with me, Senator, that our courts understand that when an American citizen collaborates with an enemy of our nation, that is an act of war by that citizen against his own country, and the law of war applies, not domestic criminal law?
I certainly agree with the Senator that an American citizen can join in a war against the United States.
And they can be treated as an enemy combatant according to our courts. And the law of war allows the following: trial or detention, or both. Is that correct?
That is correct.
You can be held as an enemy combatant without trial.
That is correct.
There is no requirement in international law to prosecute an enemy prisoner for a crime.
Absolutely. It's up to the detaining authority whether or not they believe a person has committed a crime or not.
And do you agree with me, we don't want to start the practice in the United States that everybody we capture as an enemy prisoner is automatically a war criminal, because that could come back to haunt our own people in future wars?
Absolutely.
That we should reserve prosecution for a limited class of cases among enemy prisoners.
That is correct.
And do you agree with me?
The Senator has consumed 10 minutes.
Got a unanimous consent to have one more minute?
We're just informing the senator that 10 minutes has been.
I asked to be
Okay.
informed at 10, and we'll try to wrap up because Senator Sanders, I know, is...
Okay, well, I promise we'll be through here. So let's just logically walk through this. In every war America's been involved in, American citizens, unfortunately, have chosen at times to side with the enemy. Our courts say that the executive branch can hold them as an enemy combatant, and the purpose is to gather intelligence. Do you agree with that?
That is a very important purpose of that.
Now, you've been a U.S. attorney, is that correct?
That's correct.
Does criminal law focus on intelligence gathering?
Absolutely not. It's punishment for a crime already committed normally.
Do you agree that holding an enemy prisoner, one of the benefits of capturing someone is gathering intelligence?
Absolutely.
And do you agree our criminal system is not focused on that?
Absolutely. And in fact, we explicitly tell people arrested they have a right not to provide any intelligence. Indicates that it's clearly not the primary function.
Senator, do you agree with me that if this Congress chose to change the law and say that an American citizen who's associated themselves with al-Qaeda cannot be interrogated for intelligence gathering purposes, we would be less safe?
Absolutely.
And that would be a change in the law as it exists today?
Absolutely.
Do you agree with me that your amendment that says you can be acquitted but still be held as an enemy prisoner is consistent with the law that exists today?
I certainly believe that it is.
Okay. Thank you for offering this amendment. To my colleagues, we're trying to fight a war, not a crime, within the value systems of being in the United States, being the champion of the free world. I don't believe in torturing people, but I do believe, Senator, you agree with me when it comes to interrogating people, that sometimes the best tool is time.
Absolutely. Someone may not be willing to talk today, but as time goes by, they might be willing to completely change and be forthcoming.
Do you agree with me that we've gathered good intelligence over time from people held at Guantanamo Bay?
That is certainly true.
Without waterboarding them.
Absolutely.
So my point to my colleagues, and I enjoyed this discussion, is if you take the ability to hold someone as an enemy combatant off the table, you can't interrogate them for intelligence gathering purpose, and if you put a time limit on how long you can hold them, you defeat the purpose of gathering intelligence. Do you agree with that?
Absolutely, and that would undermine one of the functions of the United States military in dealing with enemies of the state.
Do you also agree that in this war we've provided due process unlike any other war in the past?
There's no doubt. No war has ever been lawyered to the degree this war has been lawyered.
Do you agree with me that every enemy combatant, citizen otherwise, held at Guantanamo Bay or captured in the United States has their day in federal court through a habeas proceedings?
They do, and to a large degree different from any war in our history.
We've never had in the history of other wars a federal judge determining whether the military has the authority to hold someone as an enemy combatant, but we have it in this war. Do you agree with that?
Absolutely.
Do you agree that the government has to prove to an independent judge by a preponderance of the evidence that the person is in fact a member of al-Qaeda involved in hostilities?
Yes.
So everybody is held after judicial review the first time in the history of warfare. Do you also agree with me that the annual review process that we've created by this law, this bill, the Defense Authorization Act, is something we haven't done in other wars?
We have not done that before, yes.
So every detainee not only gets their day in federal court and the government must prove they have a solid case to hold them as an enemy combatant, every detainee gets a yearly review as to whether or not they're a continuing threat.
I believe it, yes, it's consistent with language in the Supreme Court opinions, recent opinions, and perhaps even goes further than what the Supreme Court required.
Are you familiar with competency hearings in the civilian world?
Yes.
In our civilian law, we can hold people that are dangerous to themselves or others. Is that correct?
It's done
without a
every
criminal
day.
trial?
Yes.
Okay, but judicial oversight.
With judicial oversight.
So would you agree with me that it is very smart to evaluate whether or not we should allow someone to be let go, and intelligence professionals should be able to make that decision as to whether or not the individual is a military threat, that is a logical process?
Absolutely is, and just for the fact of my amendment, it does not require people to be held. It only gives the government the authority to do so if they deem it's appropriate for the defense of America.
Do you agree with me that the recidivism rate of people we're releasing from Guantanamo Bay has gone up?
Yes, it's extraordinarily disappointing, actually, and against projections of many of those advocating for early release.
And some of these people have gone back to the fight and killed American soldiers.
They certainly have.
Do you agree with me that the dangers our nation face do not justify changing existing law, denying this country the ability to gather intelligence, even against an American citizen joined with al-Qaeda? That would be an unwise decision given the dangers we face.
Yes.
Do you agree with me that we need a legal system that understands the difference between fighting a war and fighting a crime?
So well said, Senator Graham. I agree.
Thank you for your amendment.
Thank you. Mr. President, with regard to the question of citizenship, I would just say to my colleagues, this in no way deals with that. Whatever the courts, whatever the bill and other laws say about citizenship will apply here. It does not change that status at all. And I do believe that the legislation is clearly consistent with the testimony of President Obama, Eric Holder, Jay Johnson, the counsel at the Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State Clinton, and others. And I would urge acceptance of my amendment and would yield the floor.
President. Senator from Vermont is recognized. Thank you.
Consent request.
Senator from Michigan.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the Cardin amendment number 1073 be withdrawn, and that has got the approval of the sponsor of the amendment.
Without objection. Mr. President. Senator from Vermont. I just wanted to say a few words about two amendments that I have offered, both of which I think are important and both of which should be passed. Mr. President, as I think you know, this country has a record-breaking deficit and a $15 trillion national debt. What many people do not know is that one of the reasons that our deficit is as high as it is because there is a significant amount of fraud from defense contractors who sell their products to the Department of Defense. I think the American people are very clear that when we pay $1 for a product that goes to our military, we want to get $1's worth of value, that we do not want to see the taxpayers of this country or the Department of Defense ripped off by fraudulent contractors. Unfortunately, fraud within the DOD in terms of private contractors is widespread. During the last number of years, we have seen company after company engaged in fraud, including some of the largest defense contractors in the United States. Just for example, Lockheed Martin, the largest defense contractor in our country, in 2008 paid $10.5 million to settle charges that it defrauded the government by submitting false invoices on a multi-billion-dollar contract connected to the Titan IV space launch vehicle program. That didn't seem to sour the relationship between Lockheed and the DOD, which gave Lockheed $30.2 billion in contracts in fiscal year 2009, more than ever before. So one of the patterns that we see is that a company gets convicted or reaches a settlement with regard to charges of fraud, but next year they continue to get very significant contracts. In another case, regarding one of the large defense contractors, Northrop Grumman, they paid $62 million in 2005 to settle charges that, quote, it engaged in a fraud scheme by routinely submitting false contract proposals and concealed basic problems in its handling of inventory, scrap, and attrition, end of quote. Despite that serious charge of pervasive and repeated fraud, Northrop Grumman received $12.9 billion in contracts the following year, 16
more than the year before. Mr. President, it seems clear to me that we need to do a much better job in terms of attacking fraud within the Department of Defense. Several years ago, I offered an amendment which was passed, which provided that the DOD list virtually all of the fraud committed within the DOD. We have that report, and it is rather astounding. People should read it. But right now, what this amendment does is it says to the DOD, get your act together, hire the necessary well-trained staff so that they are monitoring the contracts and making sure that we do not continue to see the pervasive amount of fraud committed against the taxpayers of this country or the Defense Department. And I hope very much that that amendment gets widespread support and that we see it passed. Mr. President, there is another amendment that we have offered, I think, which is equally important, and that deals with making sure the Department of Defense, which it turns out, Mr. President, is the largest single consumer of energy in the United States of America. Obviously, the Department of Defense has huge resources, controls huge numbers of buildings, has enormous aircraft and so forth and so on, and it is by far the single largest consumer of energy in the United States, accounting for approximately 90% of federal energy consumption with an annual energy cost of up to $18 billion. So the Department of Defense spends $18 billion on energy costs alone. The Department of Defense in recent years, I think, has understood the importance in trying to move toward energy efficiency in terms of saving energy, but we have a long, long way to go. The major program to help cut energy consumption and costs at our military bases is called the Energy Conservation Investment Program. This is a very, very important program, although a relatively small program. This program has operated for more than 10 years, helping to invest in programs for more energy-efficient lighting, for example, at an Air Force base in Alaska, geothermal heating at Fort Knox Army Base in Kentucky, wind turbines for an Army base in Arizona, and solar power for the Air Force in Colorado. Historically, according to the Department of Defense, every dollar used by the Energy Conservation Investment Program yields $2 in savings. We invest in energy efficiency, we invest in sustainable energy. For every dollar invested, we save $2. And this makes it a very positive program for the DOD. Some projects, such as energy efficiency improvements at a Navy base in California, achieve greater than $15 in savings for every dollar invested. The Department itself, the DOD, has stated that this program achieves, and I quote, long-term public benefits by investing in technologies that increase economic efficiency and health benefits, build new sources of renewable energy, enhance job creation, retention, improve military facilities, and improve the quality of life for our troops and their families. Unfortunately, the authorization for this program in the current Defense Authorization Bill is $135 million, relatively small amount of money for a Department of Defense which spends about $18 billion every year on energy. So I think what we want to see is, A, the DOD save money through energy efficiency and sustainable energy, and second of all, become a model for the country as we attempt to break our dependence on fossil fuel, on foreign oil, and we attempt to cut back on greenhouse gas emissions. I can tell you, Mr. President, that in the state of Vermont, we have our National Guard base where we have worked with them to install a major solar installation which will pay a significant part of their electric bill. And frankly, I would like to see this done in National Guard bases all over the country and in the active duty structures as well. So bottom line is we are currently spending about $135 million, relatively small amount of money compared to the $18 billion energy bill run up by the DOD. And what this amendment would do is increase the authorization for the Energy Conservation Investment Program to $200 million, up from $135 million. Not anywhere near as much as I think we should be doing, but it is a step forward in helping the Department of Defense save money on their energy bill, break our dependence on foreign oil, and help us cut greenhouse gas emissions. We know that there remain many worthy projects at our military bases that have not yet been funded at today's funding levels that could be funded if my amendment were to pass. The amendment is fully offset and paid for by reducing expenditures on construction at overseas bases while still leaving nearly $300 million in funding for that purpose. I think that's a decent offset. I applaud the Department of Defense and the military for the strides they have made so far in investing in energy efficiency and renewable energy. There are some wonderful, wonderful projects going on all over this country, in fact, all over the world under the DOD, and they deserve credit for that. They can and should be a leader for our country, but we still have a very, very long way to go. So I would ask for support from my colleagues for this amendment, which will save the Department of Defense money, will break our dependency, help break our dependency on foreign oil, move us to energy independence, and cut greenhouse gas emissions. And with that, Mr. President, I would yield the floor and, I guess, note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk would call the roll of the Senate.
Mr. Akaka.
Consent for readings in the quorum clause be suspended.
Without objection, so ordered. Senators recognized.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent to withdraw the McCain Amendment 1230 as modified.
Without objection.
I suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.